Hello, we are going to be mixing the Frank Riley Flesh Tone palette today. This palette has been used by portrait painters, illustrators, anyone who wants to work with a controlled palette, having their values broken down as you see in the picture. Frank Riley was asked during the WPA to create a palette so that the artists that were put to work would all work basically with the same colors and same paints. They were asked to renovate or repaint some of the federal building murals, and that's where this palette actually came to be. It was a daunting task, I would imagine, but all the artists worked together, and they were able to create a uniform flesh tone throughout all the different paintings, depending on what projects they were working on. This is a great palette for not only flesh tones, but for almost anything. Drapery, anything that needs good form lighting. And we're going to get into it right now. Actually, we're going to start with the colors. And those colors will be titanium white for all, ivory black for the gray, cadmium red, cadmium orange, alizarin crimson, burnt umber. Okay, here we start with our gray line. All right, we're going to start with titanium white and ivory black. Now, we're just creating basically a flesh palette tone. So we're going to work out a first value that's probably about, I would say maybe 5%. I'm actually mixing this on a Gray Matters palette sheet. So that usually equates to about 50%. And what I'm doing here, the reason why I put the palette knife over my hand is because I am looking to find an average, okay? You can actually do this whether in front of the model, or you can do this after the entire palette is complete. So as you can see, we're working on each line. So we're going from light to dark, obviously. Very similar to a photographer's grayscale palette. And it gets darker as I go. Now, if you're going to do this and you want your palette and your paints to last longer, I suggest in this process to use oil of cloves. And you can get that as an essential oil. And what you would do is you would just take an eyedropper, and maybe when you get to the lower values, use a little drop on each batch of paint. All right, so here's the cadmium orange, the titanium white, and the burnt umber. Okay, so we are going to start with the cadmium orange, and we're going to be mixing titanium white to the orange to bring the orange up in value, to make it lighter. So what I'm going to be doing is testing it by using the gray, okay, from the gray line. And I think I got lucky right here. I got it on the first try. That's the second value of gray, and I'm trying to mix that orange, which comes close. We have to remember that the cadmium oranges and the cadmium reds are very intense. Okay, so we need to really be careful with those values. All right, now we're moving down and mixing the cadmium orange with the burnt umber. Okay, we are no longer using white. There's no white in this mixture. Just so you guys know, if you add white, you're going to get mud really quick. So be careful not to use the white any longer. Now we're just darkening the red. So we're taking the cadmium orange and just adding the burnt umber to that to bring our values down. And as you can see, we're mixing the colors so they match rather the values that are on top. Now, I know this process gets a little messy. You might want to use two different palette sheets. I just was able to keep it clean. Okay, here's our red line, cadmium red. Now we're going to go over the colors. Cadmium red medium. You could use cadmium red medium. You could use cadmium red light. Just don't use cadmium red dark. Titanium white to bring the red up in value. Now there's going to be a 50-50 mixture of alizarin crimson and burnt umber here. So those are our colors too. Now I need to stress this because we will be using these two colors together to create the red, all right, in its darkest form. So basically, alizarin, 50% alizarin, 50% burnt umber is basically red in its darkest form. So if you were painting a red ball, this would probably be, or cadmium red ball, this would probably be the shadow value. Now this is the cadmium red. To lighten it, we're using the titanium white. And here I am mixing the value, okay? And I was able to get the color there, and I'm going to do this with each value. So I'm matching each color with each value from the top. This is how we keep our values uniform. And now I sped this up, obviously. I'm not this fast. But there you go. So now that's the red. I'm going to put the red down. So notice I put the red off to the side, and I am no longer using white. Okay, I have to stress this. I have had students add white to this thinking that they needed it, but at this point, you're only using the red straight from the tube with the mixture to get it darker, which is the 50-50 mixture of alizarin crimson and burnt umber. Okay, that's how we're getting these colors dark. And you can almost see that if you're painting something red here, you would have the full line of values. Okay, so that's something to think about. So you can actually see the banding that this palette is known for. Really, is to make sure that we have all of our values in line, so that when we go to paint anything with form, we will have all the values needed to paint it effectively. Okay, so here we go into the full palette. Okay, on the top in the inset photograph, there was a picture of the clove oil. Now, what we're going to do with the clove oil is we're going to add a drop to each one of these later on when we're ready to put the paints in a box, or just keep them so they stay fresh. The clove oil helps to keep the paint from drying too quickly. It also keeps the paint on the canvas workable a little longer. Just be careful not to overuse it, or it will take forever for your paints to dry on the palette and on the canvas. So there are times when you do want your paints to dry. There's times when you don't. Usually, when we work wet into wet, we don't want to have our paints dry too quickly. All right. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the gray line, the orange line, and now the red line, all in a vertical movement. Okay, we're not cross-matching, we're not painting or mixing our paint on a diagonal or horizontally, we're going downward. So now I have what looks like a flesh tone, It's sort of neutral because we used the red and the yellow, I'm sorry, cadmium orange, which kind of looks like a yellow at this point, and the gray line, which is neutralizing our flesh tone at this point. So as we can see, we're using the uh, the next value. Now you're probably wondering why I'm just going towards these two colors at first, because these are sort of like the base. This is sort of like the base color. Um, if, let's say, someone had more olive skin, you would probably use more of the orange. If someone had more of a ruddy skin, which is like a reddish, pinkish skin, they would obviously need more red. So here, I'm just trying to get a flesh tone, and it's probably going to be like a generic flesh at this point. Um, you can also alter the colors a little bit. So what I'm doing here is, as you can see, my hand is actually acting as a guide. If I was to paint myself, my portrait, chances are my hand colors would be close to my face color. So that gives us an average because the top of my hand is pretty broad. So, and now this pertains to portraiture or figurative painting. So either one. What you don't want to do is, and I have my students go up to the model and hover, just like I'm doing here, is hover the palette knife. Don't touch the model, but just hover it over, and making sure that the palette knife is in the same direction as the light. So you don't want it to be, you don't want the palette knife to be turned. That would cause a plane, which would make your reading too dark. So the idea here is to match the color of the complexion of the sitter. Okay, and once you have the average, then you can also check the shadow, you can check the halftones, and you can do that all the way down the line. So you will have values and colors now that would match very closely to what the model, what the sitter or model, if you're doing, again, full figurative portrait painting. You can do that with, the face. You can do that with the body. Sometimes depending on the person, the head could usually get a little darker than the body, depending on the person's complexion. So you want to do a value average of their body if you're going to paint a nude, say, and work it that way. Now here I'm just trying to get my colors to coincide with the color before it, so that they have some uniformity to them, going down to the darker value. Now, depending on the model, now I am not. I'm not a model. I'm not on. I was not on the stand. I just really use my flesh tone on my hand as a guide. But you guys would be doing this in front of your model, portrait model, figure model, or you could also work from photography, from photographs too. I suggest this palette would probably be better used from a live model. I mean, you guys could do self-portraits. If you wanted to test out this palette alone, you don't have to do something large. The beauty of this palette is you don't have to make a lot of color. This palette is very small. This palette was really only used for demonstration purposes. It's quite small, as you can see by the scale of my hand. I suggest that you mix probably double the amount of what I'm mixing here, depending on the size of the portrait. If you're doing, say, 3/4 life size or full life size, I suggest even mixing a bit more, almost like 4 times the amount of paint that you see here. because you can see my hand in scale to these batches that we're putting down are quite small. Now, as we're doing this, remember to put a couple of drops, especially in the lower values. They have a tendency to dry. The earth values, like burnt umber, alizarin crimson, the darker blacks, ivory blacks, they tend to dry quicker, probably because they don't have as much white as the higher values do. So you want to add a little bit more of the clove oil to these values here, because you don't want to run out. Even though the shadows in your painting should be relatively transparent, if, let's say, you're doing a figure painting and you need more values as you go, as you progress in the painting, you want to make sure you don't run out. Now, if you do run out, you'll still have the rest of the paint on the palette. I would suggest, too, adding some of the clove oil. And all you have to do really is put a drop on. You don't have to mix it in. Some artists actually just dab a little bit, or put a few drops on a piece of styrofoam, and they drop the clove oil onto the styrofoam, and then they use the Masterson boxes. And I don't do this, but they say the fumes keep the paints workable for a long time too. So you don't have to put the paint. Now remember too that when I say adding drops, we're not adding a lot. We're only adding about a drop or two, maybe 2 or 3 to the lower values. The clove oil is not a medium. It's I just wanted to stress this. It's really only there to create longevity in the painting. So and the mixtures. So you don't want to add too much. It's not a medium. You do not want to use this like linseed oil or liquid. It's only an additive to the paint to retard drying time. Okay, I have to stress that because I've had students use it as a medium, and what it does is it does actually break down the paint considerably. And by adding so much of the clove oil, it actually created the paint surface to stay wet for quite a while. I've almost heard students say they had their paint mixtures wet for a year. All right, there it is. That's the full palette. All right, I hope you guys got something out of this, and have a great time painting your portrait using the Frank Reilly system. All right, have a great day. Bye now.